Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray bunker. This isn't going to be a review of the film as such, but more a close-up look at its 3D, talking about how well I think it works. And this time I'm looking at the 2016 film The Legend of Tarzan. This one has an aspect ratio of 2.39 to 1, and it was post-converted into 3D. Obviously the majority of the film is set in Africa, and some of the distant landscape shots stretch a nice way into the screen. This early view made me smile a bit, as it provided a nice reminder of Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan and his escarpment home in the MGM classics of the 1930s. I think this view works quite well in the way that the mist forms a flat plane over the treetops, and those clouds look like they're forming lines that converge at the horizon, all of which help the 3D effect. Something else this view does is see the camera move steadily forwards across it, and that's something that this film does well. Lots of slow and solid camera movements, both into the frame and out of the frame, is the type of camera work that I think is very well suited to 3D. At the beginning of the film, there's a nice bit of subtle 3D when they're peering into the mist to see what's lurking beyond it, and when we get their viewpoint, I think the stereoscopic depth in the mist-shrouded scene elevates that sense of unease and suggestion of there being something dangerous out there, more than the same view would offer in 2D. And one of those guys looking into the mist there was the great Ben Chaplin, whose face here is very nicely realised in good solid 3D, which is something this film does quite well. Some of the areas where it maybe slips up a bit are some of the things that typically present difficulties for conversions. So the grass here, whilst there is some depth in the field itself, the actual grass doesn't feel like it has any sense of separation between the individual blades, or the usual problem with dense foliage, like some of the trees on the right here look quite off in the way they smear as the camera moves. So it might sound alarm bells that the jungle setting could cause all sorts of problems for the 3D, but on the whole, this is a jungle full of plants with large leaves, which seem to be put into their own 3D space much more effectively than is usually the case with smaller vegetation. There are some close-up blades of grass where the 3D is much more successful, and it looks almost like a playful bit of 3D here, the way the camera is set low to cut through it. And talking of playful 3D, there's an intentionally quite humorous shot where, having established his discomfort amongst a herd of ostriches, Samuel L. Jackson gets a faceful of one of the giant birds as it pops its head up close and personal out of the screen a bit, albeit very briefly, but it's an example, I think, where the 3D is used to be funny. And if you prefer your 3D to spend some time on the near side of the screen, you might be quite disappointed, as there aren't really all that many pop-out shots in this film. It's odd that a film featuring quite a few spears never does the obvious 3D thing with them. Instead, we get this slightly contrary version of a 3D spear shot with a view of them from behind, where it's the back of the spear rather than the pointy end that's poking out of the screen. Some debris blasts, a bit in slow motion, make for a brief fix, but they're hardly great examples of 3D pop-out. There's something that pops out during the film's climactic showdown, which would be a bit of a spoiler to show here, but it's a nice tiny symbolic thing that flies in slow motion into negative parallax. There are quite a few guns, and they pop one or two of those out of the screen. Sometimes it's done very poorly from a 3D point of view, with it being heavily out of focus and breaking the frame, and other times it's done extremely briefly, but there's a nice addition of a big old 3D muzzle flash too, even if it's only there for a few frames. Best of the guns is something a bit different from the usual pistol or rifle, and that's this strangely shiny Maxim Machine Gun, which is kept in the shot for long enough time to enjoy it poking out of the screen, and they must have liked this effect, so it's revisited later on, and it shouldn't disappoint pop-out fans either time. There are some rows of cannons where the wheels and barrels form multiple layers in three-dimensional space. Same thing with some of the riflemen too, so it's a nice bit of non-pop-out 3D gun work. And my favourite shot of guns also has them kept in positive parallax, so not popping out, but it's a really nice view where, a bit like those clouds earlier, they're creating lines pointing back into the distance, and they help the 3D to create a really good feeling of depth. Something I've always moaned about every time a film does it is the binocular shot. I kind of can't not mention it now, even though there's no real point, but here some are, and unsurprisingly, this film does it wrong, just like virtually every other film. Here's a bit where it feels like they completely forgot they were making a 3D film, that's assuming they ever knew they were in the first place, where the framing of this chap's bow and arrow isn't really done with any consideration of 3D at all, or another bit where some precious stones are being held out, and I'd have thought this would have been filmed at a slightly different angle, with his hand higher up and kept within the frame if 3D had been thought to be important. The jungle itself is quite rightly one of the stars of the show, and the 3D clearly does add to the atmosphere of the place, with views having quite a bit of depth to them, and they're very nicely photographed too. It's not in-your-face 3D, but it's certainly pleasing enough. So there's certainly some pleasant 3D going on here, although I do think that none of it is going to dazzle anyone, and I wouldn't say it ever really offers up anything in the way of 3D demo material, and this is probably a title that few, if any, 3D fans would cite as being up there with the best. It all works, and it's obviously all in 3D, but it never exactly amazes you. Some of the moments when it's at its most effective, I think, include the usual winning 3D views, and looking down on someone climbing a ladder is always one of those. So this is a really good shot with plenty of depth, but I think it suddenly looks even better when some lightning hits the scene, which makes the 3D that bit more apparent. Or there's a view up the ladder too, this one's stretching a long way back into the screen, and this is the ladder that leads to the treehouse, where the composition of the set is great for 3D. There's a lot of set design going on in there, nice and detailed, and I think this is one of the film's best 3D locations. Like that view down the ladder, 3D films quite rightly love views looking down from a height, like Leopard Man here, perched high up, or looking down from high up this tree. These shots work well and they're very welcome, and whilst we're up a tree with Sam Jackson here, you can't help this shot bringing to mind a rather more successful 3D film. This looks to me very reminiscent of Sam Worthington running across the boughs high up above a slightly more distant jungle, where, as here and as ever, greedy and vile white guys went to exploit the assets of the indigenous tribe. The 3D here might not be as impressive as Avatar's, but I think it's still perfectly serviceable and it helps to sell the shot. And whilst I'm making comparisons to other 3D films, there was a shot in Guy Ritchie's King Arthur where a candle sat in front of Jude Law, and because it was the foremost thing in the frame, the way it was placed into its correct 3D space drew attention to it in what I thought was an almost comical way. But here, where there's a similar sized candle placed in front of Margot Robbie, because we're looking over Christoph Waltz's shoulder, it sits in a much more natural space somewhere around the screen level, and it doesn't draw attention to itself at all. Or here's another comparison. The 3D Tomb Raider had a shot where the camera moved across the treetops before dropping down through them, exactly like this one, all the way to ground level, and the 3D works well here. There are quite a few compositions that make for good 3D views, like this fella suspended in a cage, dangling in 3D space, or looking at the boat here as the camera moves on past that big structure on the right. There's a not especially brilliant view a short way down some railway tracks, which maybe isn't really far enough to be a super deep railway line shot anyway, but that kind of doesn't matter, as you probably find yourself paying more attention to the somewhat odd sight of that well-dressed gentleman on the left there taking a crocodile for a walk. There's one of those nice moments where the camera's half in and half out of the water, which for some reason naturally lends itself to make for a good 3D view. Out of Africa, there's a very nice view down a London street, which stretches a good way back, and I thought it was very reminiscent of those Victorian stereo photos of the capital, albeit this time in colour and beautiful widescreen. The film uses the zoom dolly effect, which we've seen look incredibly effective in a few 3D films. It actually uses 3 zoom dolly shots in a row, the reverse angle on Christoph Waltz, and then closer in on Margot Robbie, with the background falling away in one of them and coming closer in another. Whichever way around, it's a camera technique that screams drama at you, and it's quite good here in 3D, although definitely not the best example that I've seen. There's a sequence that reminds me of another filmmaker, and not necessarily in a good way, and that's Michael Bay, when the director of this film, David Yates, sets aside what for the most part have been those nice and steady camera moves, and he does the Bay thing of swirling the camera around the actors until everyone's dizzy. I mention this not because it offers an especially impressive 3D view, but because it's actually an accidental example of a completely different type of 3D, and that's the pull flick effect, which relies on camera movements like this. It works by covering one eye with a dark lens, which I think takes advantage of the fact that your brain takes a fraction of a second longer to process a darker image, so an occasionally effective 3D view can be created, as long as that lateral movement continues. I could be misremembering this, but I vaguely recall the BBC broadcasting a fairly terrible slice of Doctor Who about 30 years ago, using this technique. We don't see as much of Tarzan swinging through the trees as you might expect, but when we do, it's done in a dynamic post-Spider-Man sort of style, but he never comes obviously out of the screen whilst doing it in a way that I don't think would have been particularly unreasonable to expect, even if it would have been rather obvious. So a very quick word about the film itself. I like this film quite a bit, and one reason for that is because it plays, to me, as a sort of semi-sequel to a film that I love, although even that one isn't all that fondly remembered by most people either. And that's a film with the same title as this one, albeit buried within a much longer title, which is the mid-80s film Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes. That was a film that most Tarzan fans were annoyed by, as it was much more an exploration of his relationship with his grandfather and his birthright, with a quite limited amount of jungle action. But this film has a similar tone and look and feel to it, especially the flashbacks to his first days in Africa, which play out just like the ones in Greystoke, and it makes up for Greystoke's lack of jungle story. Anyway, I think they would work well together as a double bill. It's interesting maybe that this film isn't really an origin story. There are some flashbacks, but it begins with Tarzan in England having assumed his position as Lord Greystoke long after he's returned from the jungle. So, like I said, it's a great looking film. The plot's about slave trading, so it presents a clear villain without any grey area, which Christoph Waltz can be obviously relied upon to do a good job of. There's a revenge story in there too, which I thought came to a good conclusion. There's an occasionally light-hearted feel to it, with some of the exchanges between Tarzan and Samuel L. Jackson's character. But the film throws in not just one, but two jokes about oral sex, which feel maybe a tiny bit out of place in the film, not in the jungle. I know some people thought Margot Robbie's Jane hit the wrong note, but I thought she fitted in well enough, and Sam Jackson and Jaimin Hunsu are good to see too. Alexander Skarsgard looked the part as Tarzan, but I don't think he had anything like the charisma that Christophe Lambert had in Greystoke. And also, whilst the CG gorillas here are fine, I do think that Rick Baker's gorilla makeup in Greystoke 35 years ago was much more visceral and compelling. So it might not be a classic slice of 3D, but it's a solid enough conversion by Prime Focus, with nice enough moments to keep a lot of 3D fans happy. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.